for explaining the cost of the broader registration. The one thing is that Interreach has affiliated. We started out of conversations within the science team science community, and Interreach has affiliated officially as a special interest group, or SIG, of that community insights. And so we have activities at every meeting. We have been doing that for years, but it's now more formalized, which is kind of nice. These webinars are pretty much our way to touch base with our whole community broadly. But we've decided that this year during the CITES conference, we're going to focus on kind of some skills and methods transfer. So we're going to have a session that is devoted to development of collaboration plans in teams, and kind of walking through a presentation of that work. And then connected with that, a presentation of a method for facilitating group, multiple stakeholder brainstorming for identification and prioritization of research questions that drive an intersectional group. So that's going to be our activity. Hopefully you guys can come, and I will pass it back to Christine, who might be able to record now and can probably answer these questions about registration cost and dates. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Christine. And yes, we are recording now, so thanks for that audible there. Does anyone else have any announcements that they want to make before I jump in? Okay, and I'll just ask that that everyone please mute yourself so that we don't get any feedback for when Dr. Weinfurt is speaking. I have, so I want to just address the question about registration dates and registration costs for the conference. We don't have final numbers on registration costs, so please check back on the insights.org website for that information when it becomes available. And registration dates, we're looking within the next, I would say, 2 months. So, but again, no final dates on when that will happen at this point. Yes, and sounds good. And then one announcement I have is that after today's webinar, I will be sending out a brief survey to get some more information about our community. So we've done a baseline survey in the past. However, since we've had growth for the last year, I thought it would be worth running again. It should only take a few minutes, so please take some time to look it over and provide your input. And I'll be sending that out via email to the Interreach listserv. All right. So with that, I'm going to introduce our webinar guest for today, who is Dr. Kevin Weinfurt. So Dr. Weinfurt is professor and vice chair for research in the Department of Population Health Sciences in the Duke University School of Medicine. He's also professor of psychiatry and behavioral science at Duke University Medical Center and a faculty member of the Duke Clinical Research Institute. Professor of Psychology and Neuroscience, and a faculty associate of the Trent Center for the Study of Medical Humanities and Bioethics. So Dr. Weinfurt received his PhD in psychology at Georgetown University and did graduate work in the history of science and philosophy of mind at Linacre College, Oxford. Dr. Weinfurt conducts research on measuring patient-reported outcomes, medical decision-making, and bioethics. And as an educator, Dr. Weinfurt co-directs Duke's master's level clinical research training program and has taught undergraduate courses in introductory psychology, judgment, and decision-making, the psychology of medical decision-making, and graduate courses in multivariate statistics and patient-reported outcomes research. So his recent paper in the Journal of Clinical and Translational Science on intellectual personality has been a source of insight and further inquiry for both me and Christine into understanding and managing professional and personal relationships. So as shepherds of boundary spanning knowledge and activities, I think that this group particularly will find the content of today's webinar highly relevant. So with that, I will ask everyone to join me in welcoming Dr. Weinfurt.
Hey, thanks so much, Christine. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
All right, welcome everyone. I apologize, I don't have a video, but I told Christine I inadvertently wore a shirt that has a pattern that will make you all sick because of the weird video effects. So, but good to be with you today. Whoops, I'm trying to click my. There we go. I just want to briefly mention that this work was supported by our Center for Translational, our Center for Translational. Holy mackerel! What am I talking about? Clinical and Translational Science Institute. There we go. So you can't see me, but this is me. That's the professional picture. This is a much more reasonable picture of where you might find me. So you can keep that in mind there. So I've spent a lot of time over the last 20 years in various scientific teams in research networks. I've chaired research networks. I've chaired grant review sections. I help a lot of the teams in our departments try to come up with grant ideas. And in a lot of these experiences, you know, many of them go very well, but sometimes we have these incredibly frustrating situations where it seems like things are just sort of going round and round, or we're revisiting the same issues, or people are getting very tense. And I've enjoyed taking in some of the team science literature to try to understand different communication patterns and different techniques for running meetings. And that's been very helpful, but it still seemed like there was something else that was not being addressed that was causing some frustration in some of these scientific meetings. And so I want to just give you right now the overall summary of my talk, and then if it seems boring, you can just tune out until the end. So first, a very obvious point that these scientific endeavors involve a quest to understand something, and that the feeling.
Hold on a second.
Sure thing.
Where are we?
The feeling that we understand something is a feeling. I'll talk more about that. And the different people try to achieve that feeling in different ways. Some prefer a strategy of simplification. Others prefer clarity about particulars. Some prefer clarity about next steps. And that when you've got extreme versions of any of these, it could be challenging but possible to manage. So that's what I want to go through today. And as I started to think about this, I found this amazing essay written by a scholar I enjoy very much, William James. He was the brother of Henry James, famous American philosopher and psychologist. And William James had an essay called The Sentiment of Rationality. It was one of his favorite things that he wrote. And it's from William James's essay that I'm getting most of the material for this. James, here's another, that's a stuffy photo of James. I gave you my beer drinking photo. Here's William James in Brazil as a young man, pretty stylish. And James, as a psychologist, noted that people recognize when they understand something about the world, that the thing makes sense based on a feeling that they experience. And he says, this feeling of sufficiency of the present moment, of its absoluteness, this absence of all need to explain it, account for it, justify it, is what I call the sentiment of rationality. And I'm going to use a more friendly language of sort of the feeling of understanding. And James also said, you know, when we feel like we understand something, there's also this experience of our mental movements being unobstructed. I just go about my work during the day. I just do the stuff I want to do, and I don't feel like I'm running into any barrier there. So that's another aspect of this feeling that things are in order, right? And so we've got this feeling, right? But then as we're going through and we encounter some phenomena that seems to be a bit of a mess that stops this sort of ability to move through the world easily, it creates a feeling of displeasure. We don't like that feeling that things are not in order. And so we want to do something in order to feel that it is in order. We want to come to some understanding that will give us this feeling, right? And James's insight is that, you know, different people might use different strategies to achieve that feeling that they understand something. And I'm going to call this intellectual personality. We might define it as a person's preferences for certain ways of thinking and for particular signs that let them know that their thinking has been successful. In other words, different people may be working toward different pictures of what it will look like to have an understanding of this phenomena that our science is studying, right? So I've got these different personalities or tendencies that are reflecting these different cravings for a particular feeling of understanding that I achieve through some different methods. And it was helpful for me to think through these things by imagining that, what different people want to see up on a dry whiteboard. You know, we use dry whiteboards a lot in our scientific meetings, and so I'm kind of going to use that as a symbol of each of the three different personalities I want to describe. And I'm not going to use James's language because it's a little bit non-intuitive. I've got my own here, but you can check the paper for James's language. But the first strategy that some people use is this idea of simplification. So when they see a big mess of phenomena here, they feel like things are in order. They have that feeling of understanding only when they've been able to reduce all of the messiness to something very simple, right? So reducing that messiness of a complex array of factors to some parsimonious overarching model or law or small set of categories. And so for people who are very strong in this type of personality, they're working very hard to get us from the mess we see right now to what are those three categories, or what is that one equation, or what's that overarching model that explains this all. And until that's up on the board, they feel a sense of unease, right? So they're looking for that. So that reflects the simplification strategy. There's another strategy that's embodied by some folks that I'll just call clarity about particulars. Now that's a very different thing, where they see a big mess and they're going to feel that they've got a handle on things only after they've been able to represent all of the particulars here. Trying to reach, as James said, a clear and complete view of the particulars of some phenomena, to be intimately familiar with all of the nooks and crannies, right? That person gets very anxious if they feel that we've left something out somehow, if we've oversimplified. It's important to them that all of the exceptions and all the little details are reflected in our picture of what's going on. And if any of those things are left out, it doesn't feel right. It doesn't feel like we have a complete understanding. So this is the clarity about particulars orientation. And these are the two sort of different ends of a continuum that James described. And I added a third group based on my experiences in healthcare research. And I call it a clarity about next steps. And this is the sense where I only feel like I understand, the things are in order when I know what I'm going to do next. What's the scientific activity I'll do next? Trying to reach that point where I know exactly what step I should take next to do the scientific work. And until I've got that, until I've got that to-do list up there, I don't feel like things are in order. I don't feel like I've got a handle on this, right? And so we've got these three different approaches: simplification, taking the mess and reducing it to some parsimonious, elegant description or law, right? We've got clarity about particulars, representing all of the richness of what's out there in a systematic way that I can get my hands around. And then we've got this clarity about next steps. I only understand what's going on to the extent that it allows me to know what to do next. And I think as all of us will look at these, we think, well, successful scientific thinking really should involve a combination of all of these, and it does. Most of the time, people are moving from one strategy to another in an iterative fashion. But there are some times when some folks have more of an extreme personality, we'll say. And so I've seen this again and again, where there's someone who's creating some tension, right? Because it seems like they're disrupting the flow of the group's work, because they're pointing out that, well, but that doesn't account for this, or this doesn't quite fit in there, or what, right? That's someone who only feels at ease when our framework has captured all of the nuances and richness, right? And they're going to keep reminding us of where our framework is missing that, because they want that feeling, right? Then there's some other people who might be frustrating because they just keep charging forward with a very simple model, and it seems premature, right? Or you've got that person who just wants everyone to stop yapping, and what are we going to do next? And I hear a lot of that in some of our networks, especially networks that have a lot of clinical investigators. So let's, and I have not mastered the art of managing these different extreme personalities. So I'm just going to throw out a couple things, and I'd love to hear what others have experienced too. But one strategy is to sort of acknowledge and validate the feeling, and the key insight here is knowing that what this person is saying is arising fundamentally from a feeling of unease, and they're trying to get to a form of a solution that will give them the sense that things are in order, right? There's a tension they feel, there's an unsettledness they feel, and they would like to feel settled. And James's brilliance was in observing that psychological fact. And so, for example, if I've got a study where, we've got a research network and we're trying to identify the different types of patients who might have a particular cluster of diseases like lower urinary tract symptoms, right? It's actually one of the networks I'm in. And the goal is to sort of redefine the different types of patients there are so we can understand them better. And if we've got someone with extreme simplification tendencies, that person might want to get that categorization of patients up on the board as quickly as possible. They want, what are the 3 clusters or the 5 clusters? They're really racing to get those, right? And for someone like that might say something like, I agree it'd be great if we could identify a few well-defined subgroups of patients. It feels like we're still sorting some of that out now, so perhaps we should first work on X, Y, and Z before we try to finalize these groupings. So trying to say, I agree, it would be great to be there, right? It would be great to have a small number of well-defined subgroups, right? So we recognize that. We've got some unease that we're not there yet, but it doesn't seem like we're there yet, but we're going to keep working toward it, right? For someone who has an extreme version of clarity about particulars, this person might seem to hold up the work because they're always pointing out details that are missing from the plan, right? And so for that type of person, we might have to say something like, I agree that we're not accounting for that detail within the current working model, and it might be important. I wonder if we can add that variable to our statistical plan as a sensitivity analysis to make sure that our findings are robust even after we account for that. Can you work with whoever the biostatistician is to write something up in our plan that addresses your concern? Right, so again, trying just to acknowledge that yes, we might be leaving something out of this, and we're not going to forget it, but we're also not going to let that sidetrack the entire flow of activity here. And then that person who is always rushing to get to find out what they're going to do, that's a little bit different. The experience I've had, I'd love to hear your experiences too, is we can help to put that more extreme person at ease by making a practice to end every discussion with a summary of next steps and responsibilities. And not all of us academicians are great at doing that. And it's frustrating to someone who has that, who needs to know what next steps are in order to feel like we're in control of things. But if the team makes a regular practice of that and they come to trust that, they might be able to weather those longer speculative discussions, knowing that we are going to come out of this with what the next steps are. A second strategy is to redirect the goal from ideal understanding to pragmatic understanding. And what do I mean by that? Well, this really pertains to differences between the simplification and the clarity about particular styles. These two orientations have a fundamental disagreement about what the true representation of the phenomenon looks like. They're both working toward different pictures of success, different pictures of what understanding looks like. Simplification folks want to get just that one elegant little thing up on the board. Clarity about particulars want everything reflected, right? One way that I have found that it's been useful to balance these two perspectives is to draw on another concept of William James. We're getting a lot of mileage out of this old guy. William James was the founder of American pragmatism, a philosophical school, and there's actually a lot of different interpretations of pragmatism. But the interpretation that I'm going to go with here is a change from asking what is true to instead asking what will work here. That's the pragmatic angle. What representation is sufficient in the case of healthcare research to improve the well-being of some population of people with a health condition, right? We just need a representation of what's going on that gets us to that pragmatic goal of trying to improve the well-being of some population, right? And we try to come to a common understanding in the group that whatever approach the group is taking now is provisional and will be reassessed in terms of how helpful it was in addressing this practical health problem under study. And so we just keep coming back to that. We don't get caught up with what's the final model, what is the right answer out there about what the subtypes of patients are. We change the goal to let's get a working framework that will allow us to do something, and that is to help some patients. And so I might say to the simplification folk, I agree this isn't the most elegant looking model right now, but it's helping us to select the best treatment for each and every patient. So I propose we work with this for now as long as it's useful. And in the meantime, we can have a subset of the team work on developing a more parsimonious model for the future, right? And for the more extreme clarity about particulars person, I might say something like, I agree we can do a lot more to understand the interesting nuances of how this condition manifests in these different types of patients, and we should keep working on that. But the working model we have now is already a major advance over the way we've been thinking about this group of patients and might translate into important improvements in care. So I propose we move ahead with this model, but know that we'll keep learning and add more details to our working model as we start to understand them. Right. So here's my summary again, that we're all trying to understand something when we're doing science. But that feeling of understanding is, as James told us, is a feeling. It's the sentiment of rationality, as he called it. and that different people, through their different intellectual personalities, will try to achieve that feeling in different ways. And we went through the 3 varieties of those. We said that, you know, sometimes, even though most of us have kind of a mix of those orientations and can move in between them, some people are more extreme in one versus another. And when we get them in a team, it can create some problems sometimes. And so we talked about a few different ways that we could deal with that. As Cristina mentioned, this is I went through all of this in a paper that came out a few months ago in Journal of Clinical and Translational Science that you can access. And with that, I wanted to leave this up on the screen for our discussion. This is just sort of a graphical summary of the things I tried to discuss. And as I say, this is really a conversation starter. I don't have any special insight in the way to solve this problem, but would love to hear what people's perspectives are on other types of intellectual personalities you've observed, or other strategies for kind of managing more extreme personalities. So with that, Cristina, I think let me just check. Yeah, that was it.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Kevin. This was really, really fantastic. And I absolutely loved seeing the way that you presented this article. I mean, I think it's just, it was really awesome to see how your brain put all of this into a visual representation. And I am having this meta experience of experiencing that feeling of the sentiment of rationality right now. This just so concisely captures my own experience. So thank you for this.
Oh, great.
Yeah. I want to open it up to the rest of the group to see if anyone has any questions.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
I'm Stefanie Lynch. I'm a scientific project facilitator at Early Detection Center in Oregon. And one of the frameworks that we use with our team is the business chemistry from Deloitte. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, but there's a lot of similarities, I think, and overlap. It divides people up into 4 groups. You have your pioneers, which in my mind is kind of your simplification folk. Your guardians, which fits pretty well with your clarity about particulars, and your drivers, the clarity about next steps. And it doesn't incorporate the other category in business chemistry, which is your integrators, the people who kind of like to bring everyone together. But I'm curious if you're familiar with that at all, and if you see any other similarities in other frameworks when you were kind of coming up with this model.
Stefanie, thank you so much. I'm not familiar with it. You know, I am not while I've been on a lot of scientific teams, I'm not a team science person. So the field is relatively new to me, and I have only a passing familiarity with it. And so I'd be very interested to hear. What was the name of that framework?
It's called business chemistry.
Okay.
And it's from a company called Deloitte, Deloitte, I think.
Okay, thanks so much, Stefanie. That's helpful. I'll look that up. And I, you know, I did a review of factors for successful teams when I wrote this paper, and I didn't find anything that was similar to an intellectual personality construct. So, but I'll certainly look that up. I know that I didn't see anything about that. And I just happened to be a William James fan and knew about this essay. It was actually one of my favorite essays. And as I was sitting in some of these meetings, I started to identify what James was talking about here. So I was just trying to sort of translate James's experience and views in these settings, but I really appreciate that tip on the business chemistry framework.
I really like yours, though. Yours kind of makes it a little bit more practical, at least for me when I'm thinking about my scientific teams. The business chemistry is much more business driven, but it does pull out kind of these keywords and some of these traits that people who might lean toward one category fall into, but it does, it's similar and also dissimilar. And so I appreciated hearing about this a lot. So thank you.
Great.
This is Christine Hendren. I love this because it already, to echo Christine Glover, this was a fantastic presentation. Thank you, Kevin. And seeing the comment that you just made, Stefanie, is the type of cross-pollination that we wanted to enable with the Inner Reach community. I love seeing that. And I think one question I have for you, Kevin, and for anybody else that wants to weigh in too, is I work in facilitation of multi-stakeholder teams, sometimes crossing disciplinary boundaries, and sometimes it's sectors, but trying to come together. Usually most of my facilitation experience is with identifying research priorities that are kind of intersectional. And so, I mean, everything that you said here is just the exact kind of thing that I had been a bit tacitly trying to navigate often. And the type of derailment that you describe hedging against, I mean, I think all of this is really useful. I wonder even if you had thought of, or if you saw in this, and then I guess to Stefanie, if she's seen it in business chemistry, I could imagine while you were talking about the kind of examples of what you would say to a person that's on the extreme end, to try and kind of bring them back in. I find myself trying to do that, maybe acting as an integrator, saying, okay, I hear, that you really want this overarching set of categories, but we don't want to hem ourselves in a priori while we're still fleshing it out. Could you imagine it being useful, I guess is my question, to create almost a template of, if you hear this, here are some things you might say for facilitators or for people running groups?
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. One challenge in doing that, and it's actually a challenge I came up with when I was trying to get some examples down, is that in my experience, when I feel like the things I said went well, they were highly contextualized in the science, and so it's hard to identify sort of generic ones. But I think I think it'd be worth a shot, and maybe just come up with some families of strategies. But I found that the dynamics of passionate scientists, some of whom are senior and have a strong sense of themselves, and some sensitivities, the wording, how long the response is, whether the response is a single response. Is it a comment I make right now, or is it really laying the groundwork for the conversation that's happening over the next 15 minutes, so that they're actually coming out of it, not feeling like someone told them to shut up, but they're coming out of it experiencing a sense that they know what their role is. It's over here, and meanwhile there's this other flow of activity. So I guess all of that to say, it would be great if we could make a guide like that. I don't know that I'm talented enough to extract from my experiences to do that, because it seems highly contextually dependent, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I want to comment on that also, Christine. I think what you were suggesting is a little bit closer to yes, but rather than yes, and so it's like making a cognitive and emotional shift at the same time, that you're asking them to shift emotionally to another position. Can you imagine such and such, as opposed to saying, yes, I hear you, will address that this way, and then have the depth of understanding of the nuance of the pool of science that you're wading in, which helps validate that they're heard. Does that make sense? What I'm saying, that he's waiting in the pool of the clinical, whatever the joint task is of the group, but not saying, I want you to shift. He's saying, this is how we can deal with your perspective.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. The yes and always works much better than yes but in these cases, and you're right. And another thing I would throw in there that I have found useful too is that one of the reasons why sometimes our scientific discussions get derailed by an extreme personality is that they're proposing something that would require more work, but they're not volunteering to do that work. And so that's why one of the examples I gave there for a clarity about particulars person who's raising an exception, that we're leaving this thing out, is to say, you're right, it's important that we try to reflect all the things that are going to be important, and we're not sure whether this will be important or not, but let's put that in as a sensitivity analysis. Could you go work with the biostatisticians and make a suggested edit to the analysis plan to incorporate that? I found that doing that sometimes helps people to know that if they are going to speak up against the flow a little bit, that we might ask them to take some responsibility for the work. So we'll do yes and, but the and might involve some effort on your part. You can't just lob stuff into the middle and hope the group's going to just deal with it.
So Amanda Cravens, I'm a research social scientist for the U.S. Geological Survey, which means that I'm often really one of the few social scientists in groups of a lot of different kinds of natural scientists. And one of the things I was thinking about with this is that I've seen it have intersections with the kind of dominant, and not a perfect correlation at all, but dominant sort of kind of intellectual evidence valued in different disciplines.
Yeah.
And I think that I really found your strategy to the pragmatic understanding useful. In again, that sort of implicitly what maybe we've been doing, but I think that part of it is not just what people are feeling from their maybe intellectual personality, but also what their disciplinary training has really pushed them to think is rigorous and valid evidence. And I guess I'm curious whether other people have seen how some of these underlying intellectual personalities might be interacting with the kind of training people might have.
Well, Amanda, I'll say that I think you're right on, and there's absolutely some disciplinary differences there. I do a lot of mixed methods research and work in areas where we'll have, an epidemiologist and a medical sociologist, and those are very different orientations. And the medical sociologists are far more comfortable with reflecting all the particulars and really trying to capture the richness in a systematic way. And they're okay if at the end of the day that doesn't all wrap up into a nice bumper sticker sized statement. Whereas some of my other colleagues that's the accepted picture, is the bumper sticker level. So I think that's a great point you made, Amanda.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think that matches what I've certainly seen in some of the teams I've worked in.
I just find this very helpful, this model, because it gets out of people being good and bad and the judgmental stuff that I know that I can go to in my head when somebody is going on and on and on about details. I think I'm one of those people thinking about what are we going to do about this and how we're going to summarize this for grants and things like that. So and it's also not superficial, your model. There's a depth of understanding about it, cognitively and emotionally. So I really like it.
Oh, thank you.
This is Christine Glover again. I just want to resurface a question that came up in the chat a little while ago from Jay Kimball. It says strategies for conflict resolution or transformation is finding something to agree upon between the two involved in the conflict of ideas. Does this apply?
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and I might suggest that what I refer to as my strategy 2 is a great instance of that, where we say, look, we've sort of been going around and around, and it sounds like we've got a different views about what the final knowledge product ought to look like. What's true understanding? What will the true picture look like? And it's not clear that we're going to resolve that, or that it even can be resolved. But can we agree that by the time this grant ends, we need to have provided clinicians and researchers a set of subtypes of patients that's going to improve the way care is delivered? It doesn't need to be the subtype but it needs to be some set of patient clusters that make sense and help clinicians. And if we can agree on that goal, then let's use that as the yardstick for assessing how we're doing. So I would view strategy 2 as an instance of that, trying to get people on a common, recognizing our common commitment to something.
Yeah, I think that's a really helpful way of coming at that. It brings me back to some facilitation training that I took when you're in conflict, really trying to get to the bottom of why does a person feel so strongly about this thing that you're conflicting over, and can you then instead work towards that particular conflict instead of the particulars about the solution.
Sure.
And then Kenan has another question here in the chat. I don't know, Kevin, if you have the chat open, but how much are you thinking of shared vision and purpose? Specific models for group dynamics begin with shared vision, allowing people to self-organize to that goal. It entails training in how to self-manage as well. And to kind of build on that, I was just thinking about, any thoughts about kind of building out a kind of self-assessment that, could be maybe employed at the beginning of a team formation so that people can self-assess and there can be a process to figure out how best to work together.
Yeah, that's a really interesting idea that Kenan had. I had not thought of having a little quiz or something. You can add the letters to your Myers-Briggs profile. I had not thought of a way to do that. I suppose you probably could come up with some items. It'd be interesting to know, though, to what extent people have awareness of what satisfies their craving to reduce that unsettledness. I question whether some of the colleagues I work with are really aware of that. So anyway, I think, but maybe to Kenan's point too, maybe it'd be interesting to think of some exercises that could be done to walk people through some, maybe thinking about the last successful scientific project they were on, thinking about a frustrating scientific experience they're on, why did they feel like it was satisfying, or why did they think this one was so unsatisfying, and then trying to reflect on what if anything that might be saying about what their emotional needs are and how they're trying to achieve them. It would be interesting to see if that might work.
This is Christine Hendren, and I just can't help but say that would be a fascinating thing to do at the Science of Team Science conference, to look at this and then maybe crowd brainstorm of what might those attributes be, or what are the different things that are at play in either your self-diagnosed thing that most of us see this really great presentation and can kind of identify which intellectual personality we might more strongly lean towards. But there could also be other things in play, such as, power dynamics you mentioned, all these other things. It could just be a pretty interesting exercise. If you were interested, I bet you that a lot of people would be interested in co-producing some thought on this there.
Yeah, yeah.
This is Erin Urquhart from NASA Goddard. Me and my colleagues were just talking about this. It would definitely be useful at the Team Science Conference to have like a condensed 5-minute version of something like this that you can kind of just introduce when you're working with new teams. That would be really helpful.
Thanks, Erin. As you all are talking here, one thought I'm having is that I think even though it is the case that there are some people who are extreme versions of these, I would want to be careful about encouraging people to think of themselves as having a static, personality, a static intellectual personality, because that might actually, first of all, I don't necessarily think that's true, and it may frustrate efforts to bring awareness there, So I'm a psychologist by training, and one thing I found is that when you give people very much want a label to help them understand themselves, and when you do that, it can be beneficial, but can also create some limitations. So it might be interesting to frame this in terms of, can we think about moments when you've experienced dissatisfaction? What was it about that moment? Because in one particular case, you may have felt anxiety because you're not getting to the level of simplification you felt we should have there, but in another case that wasn't as clear. So anyway, that's.
But without having people identify statically, I could see this be useful reflection for a group to kind of be thinking about its work in phases as well, and people be thinking about where they're happiest being kind of the leader of a phase, or happier stepping back, and some of that kind of reflection.
Yeah, I agree.
One of the groups that I was in, it's the Cymer group at the University of Wisconsin. They do this national mentor training, and for our little mini groups, they had us take a few minutes to reflect on pretty much that question: moments we experience satisfaction in a group versus not. And then we shared that. We just wrote it down and shared that with our little mini group, which was maybe 6 people. And I found that very helpful in that it was like we all let our hair down to start with. And so it made the rest of the task we had very not defensive. And it was really fun. It gave a fluidity to the flow of the ideas.
Yeah. That's terrific.
I could actually check on that. I don't remember exactly what they asked us to do. It was similar to what you suggested, but I could email them and say, hey, can you remind me what that was, and just kind of share it.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Along those lines of what everyone's talking about, I can share. Christine had mentioned that both she and I have been really taken with this paper, Kevin. And so I have, for myself, opened several meetings where I was going to facilitate a discussion with just a brief synopsis. Hey, this exists. And really, I take your point about thinking of these as more, maybe mental behaviors than static mindsets, but it's been really interesting to see how people just at least are able to table some of their initial reaction, which is, the sort of the feeling of, these people are all getting it wrong, because they're coming at it from a different angle. I've even seen just a brief mention, hey, this paper's out there. It's useful. And I wonder if you have seen that work as well, just a mention of it.
I've never called this out at the beginning of something. And I think it'd be interesting to try that. I have more often, when I've been in the role of, say, a chair of a network or head of some group, in my summaries, my sort of interim summaries about here's where it seems that we are, that's the time I find myself reflecting, doing some of the acknowledging and validation, pointing out that there are some differences among the group members in maybe what is needed at this point to feel that we know enough. And so I've been tending to do it there as more of a reaction, but I think the proactive thing is really an interesting idea.
This is Stephanie again. I was just going to bring up that I've done that with one of my teams. That's kind of a larger team for us. It's about 10 people for a science project. It's it gets a little clunky, but we opened with a business chemistry activity. And so the business chemistry puts everybody on, not a spectrum, but it recognizes that everybody has these different tendencies. It's just to what extent. And so we had people break up into whatever their primary tendency was and kind of go through this fun activity where we have them come up with one creature that might embody that style, and then one strength of that style, as well as one way in which that style can be misunderstood. And then the one thing that I think the team found most useful was one way in which other teammates can more effectively communicate with that style. And everyone seemed really interested in it. They had a lot of fun with it. There's been a little follow-up talk about it. So I think it can work. We'll see in the long term if it has any effect. I don't know that.
Yeah. Something you just said, Stephanie, was reminding me that I feel like there might be some benefit in letting people know about these different orientations, because it may encourage you to just have more patience, and to know that we're not going to go round and round and spiral here, because we understand that there are these different orientations. We're not going to let those differences hijack the whole process. But it might mean, though, that I know that some of my colleagues need to take another 15 minutes to put up all of the things that don't quite fit into these buckets up on the board. And if we don't take the time to do that, they're not going to be on board with the next step that our thinking takes, right? Or if that person is trying to rush the discussion, is trying to shut the discussion down, to be aware, that person just wants something to do. And it's good, I can have more patience for that attitude when I recognize that this is an emotional need. It's not that you're wrong about something. It's just we're fulfilling these emotional needs in different ways.
I would definitely agree with the patience. I think for us too, the other thing was getting everybody with a kind of a shared language, to kind of, if they're feeling like they're seeing somebody who's needing clarity about particulars, then they can maybe ask that question, like, are you stuck because you want more detail? And just helping with understanding. But I think you're exactly right. Understanding and patience with each other.
We're almost at time, but I'll just say that one of the things that I struggle with when I'm in meetings is that I find that I move much more quickly to a simplification. And I feel that other people ought to be there faster, and I will sometimes screw up because I've already structured the discussion according to my framework and my simplifying framework, and there are a lot of people who are, that's not helpful. They don't want to get there that way, and we want to have a lot of discussion, getting all sorts of things out on the table. And so I hope I've gotten better with that over the years, but I'm aware of that as a tendency that I have. And so when I feel that little uneasiness come up during the conversation, that we're getting away from the framework that I was clinging to, I just recognize, hey, there's that thing, and just say hello to it, and let the folks keep talking. So I've been actually finding this very helpful for myself.
What a great practice in mindfulness, Kevin.
Yes.
Thank you so much for this awesome talk, and thank you to everyone for the lively discussion. I know I have all kinds of new directions for inquiry and thoughts for some next steps. So thank you, everyone. The webinar will be posted within the next week on our website, interreach.org. And please take a look at the baseline survey that I will be sending out today. And thank you again to Kevin for this awesome topic.
It was a lot of fun. Thank you, everyone. Have a good afternoon.
Okay, bye, everybody.